Welcome to episode 200 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time we're going to talk about Led Zeppelin's little known fourth album, the Untitled record, often referred to as Led Zeppelin 4. And this is a 2014 reissue. You can spend an awful lot of time on the alpha male vinyl chat rooms on the internet trying to decide whether these reissues, the remastering that was done by Jimmy in 2014, is superior to the original pressings. I used to have like a 1970s Canadian repress, which didn't sound too bad. I think this sounds better than that. In particular, I think the couple of the songs which were quite muddy, like Rock and Roll and When the Levee Breaks, sound a lot better on this record than they did, I seem to recall. This, of course, was my gateway drug to my Led Zeppelin addiction, and I first heard it when my friend Owen Janke brought it to our school when I was in grade 4, and he brought his older brother's copy, and he said to me, "Have you ever heard Led Zeppelin?" And I said, "No, I've never heard of Led Zeppelin. Why don't you put it on?" Anyway, so we get this little portable record player. We put it on, played song after song until the teacher said that was enough. Led Zeppelin was inconsistent with learning. I disagree. In terms of what to expect, well, I'm assuming that most people viewing this have not been living under a rock, so I will simply say that this is the best hard rock album of all, but being, of course, Led Zeppelin, it is not just hard rock. It's got lots of other flavors as well. Coming together in the summer of 1968, Led Zeppelin, of course, had basically ridden the lightning since the first time they set foot in American soil in January 1969 to promote their first record. Zeppelin, of course, sounded nothing like relatively wimpy 1960s rock. They made then heavyweights, people like Cream, sound tinny and precious. They had this unbelievably heavy drum sound, an unbelievably heavy guitar sound. They were the sound of the 70s, and so as a consequence, the 1960s critical establishment sneered. They survived all kinds of scathing reviews from the sanctimonious Dylan and Beatles. And I love Dylan and the Beatles, to be clear, but the Dylan and Beatles worshipping press who had decided that rock and roll was some kind of cerebral art form which meshed electric guitars, social change, and poetry. The records were great, but the touring was the thing, because a Zeppelin concert soon becomes a real event, the like of which had not really been seen. They would stretch to 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours, 3.5 hours, and it's no accident, I think, that even people like Paul McCartney and Neil Young would make reference to Zeppelin concerts in their own song lyrics. In this period, from early 1969 to September 1970, the band played 215 gigs, which is about a gig every 3 days for 20 consecutive months. After doing some dates to promote the release of Led Zeppelin 3 in October 1970, the band then finally takes a break for 6 months, A, to catch their breath, but also B, to record this fourth album. The making of this album is all about location. Now, they recorded a lot of it at Headley Grange, which I'll talk about in a second, but this break also gave them the opportunity to go back to Bronrar, that little cottage in Wales that Robert had gone to with his family when he was younger, where Jimmy and Robert had gone to write much of Led Zeppelin 3. Being a complete lunatic, I've actually visited Bronrar. You can't really visit it properly because it's on private land, but I did walk up the road past the gate and encountered the tenant who lived there, and she was not very flustered to see me, invited me to have a glass of water. We chatted about the house and so on, still very much as it ever was in the early 1970s. The tracks for this record were basically recorded between December 1970 and February 1971. They started at Island Studios in London, and then they moved to Headley Grange, which is a former workhouse in the countryside in Hampshire. They brought in the Rolling Stones mobile studio, which came with its resident engineer, the Stones' regular engineer, Andy Johns, who had just finished working on Sticky Fingers. Also part of the deal was another member of the Stones entourage, the Stones version of Pete Best, Ian Stewart, who, unlike Pete Best, stayed with the band to be their roadie and their tour manager and lots of other things. Kind of remarkable. Anyway, he plays piano here, and he's one of only 3 people, along with Sandy Denny, who also appears in this record, and Viram Jasani, who plays tabla, other than, banks of orchestral strings, only 3 other people to play on Zeppelin records. Once the basic tracks were finished, Jimmy took the master tapes to Sunset Sound in LA, where he completed a mix that the band didn't end up being that keen on, so a third mix was actually necessary. Lots of delay. There was also lots of delay around the cover. Eventually they decided on a completely plain cover just to let the music do the talking because they were feeling kind of wounded by all the criticism from the press. Atlantic Records wasn't keen on it, but Atlantic Records learned to live with how well this record did. They also weren't sure of the track listing. They had a few other tracks that didn't make it onto this record: Night Flight, Boogie with Stu, No Quarter, and Down by the Seaside. There was some discussion of a double album, but then they would need to actually come up with more tracks. Eventually they did that, Physical Graffiti. In the end, they just elected to go with a single disc and kept all those tracks for later releases. Sandy Denny comes into the picture because both Robert and Bonzo were friendly with Dave Pegg in Fairport Convention, and Fairport Convention were basically the mother of all British folk bands from the late 1960s. Denny was their lead singer. She'd been a big part of the London folk scene in the mid-1960s. She had been spotted in a pub called the Troubadour by members of the Strawbs who had asked her to join them, and with them she'd released the first version of one of her very well-known hits, Who Knows Where the Time Goes. And then in a strange parallel with Joni Mitchell's life, who appears later in this story as well, the American folk singer Judy Collins hears this song, releases her own version of Who Knows Where the Time Goes, and it becomes a hit. And so Sandy Denny becomes quite famous for writing the song before anyone actually knew of her as a vocalist. The same thing happens for Joni around the same time, again, because Judy Collins covers a song of hers. In Joni's case, it was Both Sides. Sandy, of course, has a beautiful voice. She's quite a tragic figure. She makes a number of really great records with Fairport Convention, a bunch of other good records with other groups, and also in her solo career. But things begin to unravel in the 1970s. It seems clear in retrospect she was bipolar. She begins to injure herself deliberately by having these falls, eventually giving herself a fatal brain injury, and she dies in 1978 at the age of 31. If you don't know her stuff, absolutely seek it out. Particularly the stuff with Fairport Convention. My own personal favorite is Crazy Man Michael, but do yourself a favor, check it out. The album isn't released until November 1971, but a number of the tracks on here get a much earlier airing in concert. At their Belfast appearance on March 5th, 1971, Stairway to Heaven, Going to California, Black Dog, and Rock and Roll all feature, and they would all become regular parts of sets pretty much all the way through the 1970s, depending on the tour. Misty Mountain Hop gets a run out in Copenhagen a couple months later, gets fairly extensive play in the 1972 Japan tour, and then is pretty much shelved by the band until the Nebworth concerts in 1979. Four Sticks is played that same day in Copenhagen, but is then shelved forever by the band. When the Levee Breaks wasn't played live until 1975, when they rolled it out in the beginning parts of their US tour. It didn't go well, so they basically shelved it. I think it was only played 3 times in history. And the Battle of Evermore was only introduced in 1977 into their live set as part of their reintroduced acoustic set. Plant describes Black Dog as Do It in the Bath music. That's kind of an earthy reference. It's actually a fairly complex tune. It was written by Jones. The key bit is the main riff, which is in 5/4, while Bonzo is playing 4/4 because he was finding the turnaround tricky to handle if he actually stuck with the beat. So he just plays 4/4 all the way through, and somehow it strangely kind of works. Rock and Roll, of course, has got Ian Stewart in piano. This is a guy who was kicked out of the Stones for not being good looking enough. I mean, that is richly ironic. Anyway, he gets his revenge here because he plays in a song which rocks much harder than I would argue the Stones ever rocked. Sorry, Stones fans, and I'm one of them, but it's true. The Battle of Evermore is the most Tolkienian of all Tolkien song references in the Zeppelin catalog. This is also, of course, Sandy Denny's contribution, and I think her piece in this song is just magnificent. Now we come to Stairway to Heaven. I love the backwards masking. I love the satanic life hacks, very helpful. I also think this is the only good use of a recorder in the entire history of Western popular music. On a more serious note, shout out to John Bonham, whose drum fills are a major part of why this song is so good. Side 2 starts with Misty Mountain Hop, which is just a good, honest drug song. Every band really had to have one in the 1970s. And then we come to Four Sticks, an interesting track. If there is such a thing as an obscure track on one of the best-selling records of all time, I guess this is it. Page apparently wanted this to be, quote, a bit abstract, and it's tricky because the main riff is in 5/8, and then the turnaround switches to 6/8, and this apparently was very difficult to play, and so as a consequence, as I mentioned, it's barely ever played live. Going to California is one of my very favorite Zeppelin tunes. This is a magnificent piece of folky brilliance and a wonderful tribute to Joni Mitchell, who at this stage in her life had probably about half of all of the high-profile male rock stars in the world absolutely in her thrall. Such is the power of this beautiful and talented woman. Finally, it had become a bit of a tradition for Zeppelin to close out their records with a kind of bluesy workout, and this record's no different, with, of course, When the Levee Breaks. This is a very unique sounding track, not just because of those mammoth drum beats, which of course is so well known, but because a number of the passages of the song were actually recorded at a faster tempo in a different key and then slowed down to match, which is why that kind of swirling sound that you get from the harmonica and the lead guitar in particular occurs, why everything seems like it's just coming out of this primordial soup. And this song is one of Jimmy's favorite mixes in their whole catalog. Well, I guess you have to say this record's not bad. It's the kind of record that you can fall in love with, obsess over, get tired of, and then 4 or 5 years later just fall in love with all over again. And I'd go so far as to say, if you can't find at least some parts of this record to like, I don't blame you, but it must be for chemical or dispositional reasons because the music on here is so good. 50 years after its release, no serious music collection should be without it. It's a magnificent achievement and it's 5 out of 5.